Every night after finishing his taxi shift, Ethan Carter spent part of his own paycheck on dinner for a woman everyone ignored. She sat alone at the same bus stop, wore the same old coat, and looked like she had nowhere else to go. For almost a year, Ethan brought her food without ever asking for anything in return. Then, one night, she vanished. No goodbye. No explanation. 5 days later, a young woman and a lawyer knocked on Ethan's door, and what they told him about the woman he thought he knew made him question everything. Because before she died, that woman had been searching for one thing. Not a doctor, not a miracle, but the right man for her only daughter. A cold autumn wind drifted through downtown Lexington, Kentucky. Streetlights reflected off damp sidewalks, and the nearly empty roads carried the last traces of traffic as midnight approached. Ethan Carter drove slowly through the quiet streets, his yellow taxi moving beneath rows of aging maple trees that lined Riverside Avenue. At 32 years old, Ethan looked older than his age. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders built from years of hard work rather than exercise. His dark brown hair was usually cut short because it was easier to manage during long shifts, and a permanent shadow of stubble framed his strong jawline. His deep-set hazel eyes often carried a tired look, the kind that came from years of worrying about things that never seemed to improve. Most people who met Ethan described him as dependable. He was polite, patient, and rarely complained. But those qualities had not come naturally. 5 years earlier, after his father passed away from a sudden heart attack, Ethan had inherited not only grief, but also thousands of dollars in debt. Medical bills, unpaid loans, and mortgage payments nearly destroyed what remained of the family's finances. Since then, Ethan had spent most of his life working. His dreams came second. Survival came first. Every night, after finishing his taxi shift, he followed the same routine. He parked near a small diner called Miller's Grill, a modest family-owned restaurant that stayed open late for truck drivers and shift workers. The owner, a cheerful woman named Linda Miller, was in her early 60s, with silver hair tied into a loose bun and a warm smile that seemed capable of calming almost anyone. As Ethan entered, Linda already knew what he wanted. "The usual?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Chicken soup and a turkey sandwich." Linda smiled knowingly while preparing the order. The meal wasn't for him. It never was. 10 minutes later, Ethan walked several blocks toward Riverside Park, carrying the paper bag carefully in one hand. Near the edge of the park stood an old bus stop that had not been renovated in decades. The metal bench was rusted. The roof leaked whenever it rained. Most people avoided the place after dark. But every night, someone sat there. Margaret Bennett. At first glance, she appeared to be another forgotten soul living on the streets. She was 56 years old, thin and almost to the point of frailty. Her shoulder-length gray-blonde hair had become noticeably thinner over the past year, though she always tried to brush it neatly. Her pale skin seemed almost translucent beneath the glow of the streetlights, and dark circles rested beneath gentle blue eyes that never lost their kindness. Her clothing never changed much: a faded brown coat, simple slacks, worn shoes. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or privilege. If anything, she looked like someone life had quietly abandoned. Many people in the neighborhood assumed she was homeless. Others simply ignored her. Margaret never corrected them. She sat quietly, watching the traffic and the river beyond the trees. That evening, she looked up as Ethan approached. "You're late," she said softly. Ethan laughed. "5 minutes. 5 minutes is late." Her voice carried a playful warmth that always made him smile. He handed her the paper bag. Margaret carefully opened it and inhaled the aroma of the soup. "You spoil me. I bought soup. It's still spoiling me." They sat together beneath the shelter while distant headlights moved across the road. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence never felt uncomfortable. In some strange way, it had become part of their friendship. When Ethan first met Margaret almost 10 months earlier, she had refused the food. Pride had filled her eyes. She insisted she didn't need charity. But Ethan had quietly left the meal beside her and walked away. The next evening, he brought another, then another. Eventually, she accepted. Not because she needed the food, at least not entirely, but because she realized Ethan wasn't offering it out of pity. He genuinely cared. "How was work?" Margaret finally asked. "The same? You always say that, because it's always true." She smiled. "Then tell me something that isn't." Ethan leaned back against the bench. The question lingered. There weren't many interesting things happening in his life. Most days blended together. Drive passengers, pay bills, sleep, repeat. Sometimes he wondered if life would always remain that way. "What did you want to be?" Margaret suddenly asked. Ethan frowned. "What? When you were younger?" He stared toward the river. Nobody had asked him that question in years. "I wanted to start my own transportation company." Margaret turned toward him. "Really?" "Not a big one." His voice softened. "Something that helps elderly people get to appointments, disabled veterans, people who don't have family around." Margaret listened carefully. "You still think about it?" "Sometimes. Why don't you do it?" Ethan laughed quietly. "Because dreams cost money." For a moment, Margaret said nothing. The smile on her face faded. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that seemed almost sad, as though she understood far more than she was willing to say. The wind picked up around them. Margaret pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. A brief cough escaped her lips. Then another. Longer this time. Ethan's expression changed immediately. "You okay?" She nodded too quickly. "Just a cold." But Ethan wasn't convinced. Lately, her coughing had become more frequent, and every week she seemed a little weaker, a little thinner, a little more tired. Yet whenever he asked, she always gave the same answer. "I'm fine." That night, as they sat beneath the dim bus stop lights, neither of them realized how much their lives were about to change, or that the simple routine they had built together was only the beginning of a story neither could have imagined. The weeks turned into months, and without either of them planning it, the old bus stop near Riverside Park became the most important place in Ethan Carter's life. Every night followed a familiar rhythm. Ethan would finish his taxi shift shortly before midnight, stop by Miller's Grill, pick up Margaret Bennett's dinner, and walk through the cool Kentucky air toward the bus stop. Some nights were windy, some brought rain. Others were quiet enough that the distant sound of the river seemed louder than the traffic. Margaret was almost always there. She sat on the same bench beneath the flickering light, wrapped in her faded brown coat. The illness she never discussed continued to leave its mark on her body. Her face had grown thinner over the months, and the gentle blue eyes that once seemed merely tired now carried a deeper exhaustion. Yet despite her weakening appearance, she never lost the calm dignity that surrounded her. Ethan often found himself looking forward to those conversations more than anything else in his day. His life otherwise felt painfully repetitive. Work, bills, sleep, repeat. There were no close friends left from his younger years. Most had moved away, married, or built careers while Ethan spent his 30s driving strangers across Lexington. Sometimes he wondered if he had somehow missed the train everyone else had boarded years ago. One particularly cold evening, Margaret surprised him. "What was your mother's name?" she asked. Ethan looked up from his soup. "Rebecca." Margaret smiled softly. "You don't talk about her much." "Not because I don't think about her." "What was she like?" For a moment, Ethan stared across the dark street. Memories surfaced slowly. "She was stubborn." Margaret laughed. "That's usually how people describe someone they loved." Ethan smiled. "She worked 2 jobs for most of her life. Never complained. Never felt sorry for herself, even when things got hard." Margaret listened carefully, as she always did. "My father taught me responsibility," Ethan continued quietly. "My mother taught me kindness." Margaret lowered her eyes. "That's a rare combination." Ethan noticed something then. Whenever the conversation turned toward family, Margaret seemed both interested and sad, as if the topic touched a wound she carried everywhere. Several nights later, she finally revealed a small piece of her own life. It happened unexpectedly. A young woman walked past the bus stop, pushing a stroller. Margaret watched her disappear down the sidewalk. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she smiled. "My daughter used to love parks." Ethan looked over. The comment had come out naturally, almost accidentally. "You have a daughter?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." For the first time, Ethan saw genuine warmth spread across her face. "What is she like?" Margaret's eyes softened. "Strong." The answer came immediately. "Smarter than me." "I doubt that." Margaret laughed quietly. "Trust me." Ethan waited for more. None came. After months of knowing her, he had learned patience. If Margaret wanted to share something, she would. If she didn't, no amount of questioning would change her mind. But over the following weeks, small details appeared. Her daughter loved books. She worked too much. She hated seeing people treated unfairly. She always called her mother on Sundays. Each detail sounded less like a casual observation and more like evidence of profound love. Whoever this woman was, she clearly occupied the center of Margaret's world. One rainy evening, while water drummed softly against the metal roof of the bus shelter, Margaret asked a question that caught Ethan completely off guard. "If you met a woman who desperately needed someone to stand beside her," she said, staring into the darkness beyond the road, "would you stay?" Ethan frowned. "What kind of woman?" "A woman carrying more than she can handle alone," he chuckled. "That's oddly specific." Margaret didn't smile. Her expression remained serious, almost searching. "I mean it." Ethan considered the question. "I guess it depends." "On what?" "Whether she wants help." Margaret studied him carefully. "And if she did?" The question lingered between them. Finally, Ethan shrugged. "If she was a good person, I'd stay." "Even if it was difficult?" "Life is difficult." Margaret continued watching him. "Most people leave when things become inconvenient." Ethan thought about his parents, about the years spent paying debts that weren't entirely his, about sacrifices nobody noticed. You don't abandon people just because helping them becomes hard. For several seconds, Margaret said nothing. The look in her eyes unsettled him. It wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was something deeper. As if she had finally heard an answer she had been searching for. The wind pushed rain against the shelter. Margaret slowly looked away. "That's good to know," she whispered. Ethan laughed lightly. "What is?" But Margaret simply smiled and changed the subject. Yet as they continued talking that night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation had been about something far more important than either of them had admitted. And for the first time since meeting her, he began to wonder whether Margaret Bennett had entered his life for a reason neither of them was ready to explain. Winter arrived quietly in Lexington. The trees surrounding Riverside Park stood bare beneath gray skies, and cold winds swept through the streets long before sunset. The familiar bus stop near the river seemed lonelier than usual, its rusted bench coated with a thin layer of frost each morning. At first, Ethan Carter didn't notice how much Margaret Bennett's condition had worsened. The changes came gradually, a cough that lasted a little longer, a meal left half-finished, longer pauses during conversations, more moments when she simply stared into the distance as if gathering enough strength to remain present. One evening, Ethan arrived carrying the usual dinner from Miller's Grill and immediately knew something was wrong. Margaret looked exhausted. Her skin had lost much of its color, and the faint blue veins beneath her pale hands seemed more visible than ever. The warmth that normally brightened her eyes had dimmed beneath a layer of constant fatigue. "You should see a doctor," Ethan said. Margaret smiled gently. "You ask me that every week. Because every week you look worse." She laughed softly, but the laugh turned into a violent coughing fit. The sound echoed beneath the shelter. For nearly 30 seconds, she struggled to catch her breath. Ethan's chest tightened. Watching someone suffer while pretending everything was fine felt unbearable. When the coughing finally stopped, Margaret wiped her mouth and looked away. For the first time since he had known her, she seemed embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For making you worry." The answer unsettled him. People usually apologized for causing problems. Margaret apologized for being cared about. That realization stayed with him long after he drove home that night. Over the following weeks, their conversations became shorter, not because they had less to say, because Margaret often lacked the energy. Sometimes she simply listened while Ethan talked. He told her about difficult passengers, about old memories of his parents, about ideas for the transportation service he still dreamed of building someday. She listened to every word, always, as if every conversation mattered, as if she was trying to memorize them. Then one evening she surprised him again. "You'll build it one day." Ethan laughed. "The transportation company?" Margaret nodded. "You talk about it like it's impossible." "It is impossible." "No." Her voice remained calm. "It just hasn't happened yet." There was something strange about the certainty in her tone. Before Ethan could ask what she meant, another coughing spell interrupted her. This one lasted longer than any before. When she finally recovered, her eyes looked glassy with pain. That night was the first time Ethan watched her walk away and felt genuinely afraid. 3 days later, Margaret didn't appear. At first he wasn't concerned. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she simply needed rest. The following night, her seat remained empty. The night after that, it was still empty. A full week passed. Every evening, Ethan stopped at the bus stop carrying a dinner that nobody collected. The untouched meals began to feel like silent reminders of something he didn't want to acknowledge. Linda Miller noticed immediately. One evening, while packing the usual order, she looked up from the counter. "Still no sign of your friend?" Ethan shook his head. Linda's expression softened. "I hope she's okay." "So do I." For the first time, he heard worry in his own voice. 2 weeks passed. The empty bench never changed. The silence surrounding it became unbearable. After finishing his shifts, Ethan started searching. He walked through Riverside Park, checked nearby shelters, visited small churches that offered temporary assistance, asked people who spent time around the neighborhood. Nobody had seen Margaret. One afternoon, he met Harold Jenkins, a retired park groundskeeper in his 70s. Harold was a stocky man with weathered skin and a thick white mustache. Years of outdoor work had left his hands rough and calloused, but he possessed the patient kindness often found in people who had spent their lives helping others. When Ethan showed him a photograph he had secretly taken of Margaret months earlier, Harold studied it carefully. "I've seen her around." "Recently?" Harold slowly shook his head. "Not for quite a while." The answer felt like another door closing. As days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself thinking about her constantly. Not because he felt responsible for her. Not because he pitied her. The truth was harder to admit. Margaret had become part of his life. She was the person who listened when nobody else did. The person who believed in dreams he had already started abandoning. The person who somehow made him feel understood, without ever speaking much about herself. One freezing evening, Ethan sat alone on the rusted bench. The paper bag containing her dinner rested beside him. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. Cars passed. People hurried home. Life continued moving forward. But the empty seat beside him remained unchanged. For the first time since meeting Margaret Bennett, Ethan allowed himself to wonder whether he would ever see her again. 3 weeks had passed since Ethan Carter last saw Margaret Bennett. Winter had settled fully over Lexington, and each day seemed colder than the one before. Ethan still found himself looking toward the old bus stop whenever he drove near Riverside Park, almost expecting to see Margaret sitting beneath the shelter with her familiar smile. She never appeared. Then, on a gray Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Ethan had just finished a morning maintenance appointment for his taxi when his phone rang. The caller identified herself as a legal assistant from Brennan and Associates, one of Lexington's most respected law firms. She politely requested a meeting. When Ethan asked why, she simply said, "It concerns Margaret Bennett." His heart immediately sank. 2 hours later, Ethan stood inside a modern office building overlooking downtown Lexington. The reception area alone looked more expensive than anything he had ever entered. A few minutes later, a woman stepped into the waiting area. She looked to be around 28 years old. Tall and elegant, she carried herself with quiet confidence rather than arrogance. Her chestnut brown hair fell neatly past her shoulders, and her clear green eyes immediately reminded Ethan of someone, Margaret. The resemblance was unmistakable. Her name was Charlotte Bennett. Even before introducing herself, Ethan knew. This had to be Margaret's daughter. Charlotte extended her hand politely. Unlike many wealthy people Ethan had occasionally driven in his taxi, she showed no sign of superiority. Yet there was sadness behind her composure, a sadness that looked recent and raw. "I appreciate you coming," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Where's Margaret?" Charlotte's eyes lowered. The answer came before the words. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, she said softly, "My mother passed away 3 days ago." The room suddenly felt smaller. Ethan stared at her. A part of him had expected bad news, but hearing it spoken aloud was different. Much different. What happened? Cancer. The single word explained everything. The coughing, the exhaustion, the weight loss, the disappearing energy. All the signs he had seen for months suddenly fit together. Charlotte guided him into a conference room where another man waited. Richard Brennan was in his early 60s, lean and sharply dressed with silver hair and calm blue eyes. Decades as an attorney had given him a habit of speaking carefully and listening more than he talked. Richard shook Ethan's hand. Then he opened a thick folder resting on the table. What followed left Ethan speechless. Margaret Bennett had not been poor. Not even close. She had been the majority owner of Bennett Holdings, a real estate corporation whose assets stretched across several states. The company controlled commercial buildings, apartment complexes, and development projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan genuinely thought there had been some mistake. The woman who wore a faded coat and sat at a broken bus stop could not possibly be the owner of such wealth. But Charlotte quietly explained everything. 2 years earlier, Margaret had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. The prognosis was devastating. Doctors informed her that treatment might extend her life, but not save it. For months, Margaret struggled with fear. Not fear of death, fear for Charlotte. Charlotte was successful, intelligent, and financially secure. But Margaret worried about something money could never buy. Trust. Several people who entered their lives seemed more interested in the Bennett fortune than in Charlotte herself. After ending 2 painful relationships, Charlotte had become guarded and cautious. Margaret hated watching her daughter lose faith in people, so she made an unusual decision. She stepped away from her privileged life. She dressed simply, lived anonymously, spent time among ordinary people, and watched. She wanted to see whether genuine kindness still existed when wealth and status disappeared. Then she met Ethan. Richard slowly slid several journals across the table. The covers were worn from use. "My mother wrote almost every day," Charlotte explained. Ethan opened one carefully. The first pages mentioning him appeared nearly a year earlier. Margaret described the first dinner he brought, the nights he checked on her during storms, the evenings he stayed longer because she seemed tired, the fact that he never once asked what he might receive in return. Page after page carried similar observations. Not grand heroic acts, small acts, consistent acts, acts of kindness performed when nobody was watching. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Charlotte smiled sadly. "She talked about you constantly during the last few months." Richard then handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was Margaret's final letter, along with legal documents establishing a financial gift large enough to fully fund Ethan's transportation service dream. Margaret had left him the opportunity he never believed he would receive. Not because he earned her money, but because she believed he would use it to help others. As Ethan stared at the documents, struggling to process everything, Charlotte quietly looked toward the window. For the first time since entering the room, she allowed herself to cry. And Ethan realized that behind the wealth, the lawyers, and the shocking revelations sat a daughter who had just lost the person she loved most in the world. The weeks following Margaret Bennett's funeral were some of the most emotionally complicated weeks of Ethan Carter's life. Every evening after work, he sat alone in his small apartment with one of Margaret's journals open in front of him. The worn leather covers carried traces of years of use, and every page seemed to reveal another part of the woman he thought he had known. At first, reading them felt almost intrusive. Then it became impossible to stop. Margaret had written about everything, not just her illness, not just her fears, but her hopes, especially her hopes for Charlotte. One journal entry described the night Ethan walked several blocks through freezing rain simply to deliver dinner because he worried Margaret had not eaten. Another described how he always listened before speaking, how he never treated her as a burden, how he never once asked who she was or what she could give him in return. As Ethan continued reading, a realization slowly formed. Margaret had never been searching for charity. She had been searching for character. The journals revealed a mother terrified of leaving her daughter alone in a world where trust had become difficult. Charlotte Bennett had spent much of her adult life surrounded by people attracted to wealth and influence. Those experiences had left scars invisible to most people. While she remained kind and compassionate, she had become cautious about allowing anyone close. Margaret had noticed that, and it worried her more than her illness. The following month, Charlotte invited Ethan to lunch. At first, the meeting felt uncomfortable. Neither knew exactly how to interact with the other. They were connected by grief, but still strangers. Charlotte remained polite, but distant. Ethan understood why. From her perspective, he was simply a taxi driver who had unexpectedly appeared during the final chapter of her mother's life. Trust could not appear overnight. Still, they continued meeting, sometimes to discuss the journals, sometimes to review Margaret's final wishes, sometimes simply because talking about her helped both of them. As the weeks passed, Ethan began seeing the woman behind the elegant appearance. Charlotte was intelligent, organized, and remarkably hardworking. Despite her family's fortune, she handled much of the foundation planning herself. She believed responsibility mattered more than privilege, a value Margaret had clearly passed on to her. One afternoon, Charlotte showed Ethan an unfinished project her mother had started before her death. The Margaret Bennett Foundation. Its purpose was simple: help people facing difficult circumstances regain stability and dignity. As Charlotte explained the plans, Ethan suddenly understood something. The transportation service he had always dreamed about could become part of that mission. For the first time, the future no longer felt impossible. Months of planning followed: lawyers, permits, insurance paperwork, vehicles, staffing requirements. The process was exhausting. More than once, Ethan questioned whether he was capable of building something so large. Whenever doubt appeared, Charlotte reminded him of the same thing Margaret had believed. "You've already spent years helping people without resources," she told him one evening. "Now you're simply doing it on a larger scale." The words stayed with him. Almost exactly 1 year after Margaret's death, the first vehicles of Carter Community Transport entered service. The company focused on helping elderly residents, disabled individuals, and low-income patients reach medical appointments safely and affordably. The opening day felt surreal. Ethan stood beside the first van, bearing the company logo, while local reporters asked questions. For years, he had hidden that dream from the world. Now it was real. Charlotte stood nearby, watching proudly. The foundation also officially launched that same year. Under Charlotte's leadership, it funded transportation assistance, emergency housing support, and programs for vulnerable families throughout central Kentucky. As they worked together, something unexpected happened. The friendship between Ethan and Charlotte slowly deepened. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden confession, only hundreds of small moments, long meetings, shared challenges, conversations about Margaret, laughter returning after grief, trust built one day at a time. Both understood the strange path that had brought them together. Neither was interested in the other's money. Neither was trying to fulfill some romantic fantasy left behind by Margaret. What grew between them developed naturally because they admired the same values: compassion, honesty, responsibility, the qualities Margaret had spent her final years searching for. Several years later, one tradition never changed. Every year on the anniversary of Margaret Bennett's passing, Ethan and Charlotte visited the old bus stop near Riverside Park. The shelter had been renovated, but the bench remained. They always brought a warm dinner. They placed it gently on the seat where Margaret had once waited. Then they sat together for a while in silence, because that forgotten bus stop was where everything had started. It was where a lonely taxi driver met a woman the world misunderstood. It was where a mother spent her final months proving that genuine kindness still existed. And it was where Margaret Bennett quietly completed the final mission of her life before saying goodbye. Before we leave this story, remember this: Ethan thought he was only delivering a simple dinner to a lonely woman sitting at a bus stop. He never imagined that those small acts of kindness would change the course of his life. But maybe that's how God often works. Not through thunder, not through miracles we can see immediately, but through ordinary moments a warm meal, a listening ear, a helping hand offered when nobody is watching. Margaret was searching for proof that goodness still existed in the world, and God placed Ethan in her path at exactly the right time. In return, God used Margaret to remind Ethan of the dream he had buried years ago. Perhaps the greatest miracle in this story wasn't the inheritance. It wasn't the fortune. It wasn't even the love that later grew between Ethan and Charlotte. The greatest miracle was that 3 lives were brought together at exactly the moment they needed one another most. And maybe that's true in our own lives too. Sometimes the person standing in front of us today may be carrying a burden we cannot see. A simple act of kindness could become the answer to a prayer we never knew they were praying. So never underestimate the good you can do with a few minutes, a few words, or a caring heart. If this story touched you, please leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences with kindness. Share this video with someone who may need a little hope today. And if you enjoy stories that remind us of faith, compassion, and the quiet ways God works in everyday life, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. May God bless you and your family, fill your home with peace, strengthen you during difficult seasons, and surround you with people who truly care about you. And may you never forget that even the smallest act of kindness can become part of a miracle far greater than you can imagine. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next story.